Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternities, a live discussion on Star Trek Deep Space Nine. We'll be covering seasons 1 through 3 of Deep Space Nine. I'm joined here by a very special guest. Recently just got into his channel, watching a lot of his podcasts. Wes, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you very much for having me. It'll be good. It'll be good to talk about Star Trek where I'm not the lead chair of the discussion. That's your job. You're responsible for guiding the conversation. So, yeah, thanks very much. Thank you for the kind words about the podcast. If you guys don't know, I have a YouTube channel that the primary focus at this point is Star Trek podcast and coverage. We did TOS, we did TNG, we did DS9 seasons 1 to 3. So when you contacted me, you said, what do you want to talk about DS9? I said, how about seasons 1 to 3? Because they're fresh in my mind and I know what I'm talking about. But yeah, thank you again. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and for me, if you're familiar with my channel, I've done random episode reviews. I just go all over the place. But I started a thing last year where I cover an entire season of a show, and I'll go season by season. I did that with Voyager, and then I just finished wrapping up Babylon 5, and now I'm about to start Deep Space Nine. In fact, I already recorded my first season 1 review for Deep Space Nine. So just as you're wrapping up your first 3 seasons of Deep Space Nine, I'm starting my first 3 seasons of Deep Space Nine. And
why'd you pick Voyager?
Because the reason why I picked Voyager first, and again, I'm doing it all out of order, is because to me, Voyager was unique amongst the Star Trek shows and I know some people disagree with this, but I actually think the earlier seasons are sort of better than the later seasons, whereas I think all other shows like Enterprise, Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, the earlier seasons aren't as good and it gets better later on. So for me, it made me more attracted to examine each season because I thought Voyager is more of an interesting case, I should say, how each season differs from one another.
Yeah, I know that we're not supposed to talk about Voyager. I haven't seen Voyager in a long time. I think Voyager, you're not the first person I've seen who started with Voyager when they started doing those things, but Voyager has a critical aspect to it. I think that's interesting. It's a lot of there's a lot that you can sort of break down in a way that the other series don't have. I think it's just because of I view Voyager as kind of like the nadir of the franchise. It's kind of like the downslope. So there's a lot to analyze about why things happen that way. But we're here to talk about DS9. I don't know if you want to get started with that.
Yeah. And I was going to say with Deep Space Nine, season 1, I just watched it, so it's still fresh in my mind, but I haven't actually rewatched season 2 or 3 yet. But I've seen the show maybe 5 times in total, and some of the episodes I've seen a whole bunch of times, so I'm pretty much can do most of any part of the show by memory pretty much.
That's a question I have for you actually before we start.
Yeah, sure.
So since I started doing the podcast, I have less faith in my memory of things that I haven't seen recently. Do you feel that's the case for you? Or do you think that you know what I mean? If someone asks me for my opinion about something and I haven't seen it within a couple months, I feel very wishy-washy about letting them know how I feel about it, because I'm kind of going on an emotional memory as opposed to any sort of critical analysis of it. It'd be I'll really remember, I didn't really like that. And then I look at my scoreboard of scores and I gave it a 4 out of 5 and oh, I don't remember it that way. I was just curious what you thought about that.
Yeah, I mean, with me, it's a lot of shows that I've only seen once or twice, say Battlestar Galactica or Babylon 5. My opinion on Babylon 5 completely changed because I'd only seen it once before, 10 years ago. But so I feel the same way as far as those shows goes. But with Star Trek, I've except for maybe Enterprise, I've seen them all so many times, and I've seen the episodes so many times that I'm pretty confident in my memory of it, even if I didn't view it recently.
Sure.
Although I would say my opinion of some things just does change slightly. On the rewatch, when I did the Voyager recently, there's a couple of episodes in particular in season 3 which I didn't think much of before, but after rewatching I was these are the worst of the show. So my opinion does change slightly, but I'm pretty sort of confident on what I recall.
Yeah, I feel it's the ones that sneak up on me are the ones that when I was younger I remember being bad episodes, and I watched them as a older person and I appreciate them more. It's kind of like the episodes that didn't have any action as a kid. You were kind of like, yeah, this is boring. I don't want to watch this. But stuff like Sarek on TNG, I think Sarek was an episode that I didn't really like when I was younger, but now I think it's like one of the top 10 episodes the show ever did. So it's an interesting kind of change. As you get older, you appreciate different things.
Oh yeah, definitely. It's definitely the case. Cool. So let's go ahead. Let's jump into Deep Space Nine. I suppose we've kind of already been talking about our feelings of the show overall. But just really quick, just feelings of the show overall. I'll say for me, like I recently, like a couple months ago, I did a like top 20 sci-fi fantasy shows. I was trying to rate them. It's always hard putting together lists like that, so I wasn't actually sure where it'd fall. And Deep Space Nine actually ended up being my number one, which kind of surprised me. And that's something when I do this rewatch of the show, I'm going to be curious to see if I still feel that way, if I still feel this is the best sci-fi show of all time. Because I used to have Game of Thrones as my favorite sci-fi show, but the last season disappointed me so much. I was like, nah, I can't have that at number one anymore. And Deep Space Nine kind of filled that void for me. So I'm sort of coming in the plus. I've always said historically that Deep Space Nine was my favorite like Star Trek show out of the Star Trek series, although it's really close between this and Next Generation for me. So I kind of have that sort of love of Deep Space Nine. So it's interesting going back and watching the first two seasons and being like, ugh, yeah, maybe it's not as good as I remember. But anyway, some of your thoughts on Deep Space Nine.
For Star Trek as a whole, TNG is my series. It's the series that I hold closest to my heart because it's the series my grandfather introduced me to Star Trek. And I remember sitting at his place watching the show when it came on, whatever time it came on syndication. It came on at like 5 o'clock on a Saturday or something. It was the weirdest time. And he would sit there and watch it. He loved TNG. I love TNG. I really only grew up watching TNG. I didn't watch any of the others. I can say now that I'm familiar with the other series, DS9 is a better series than TNG is as like a piece of artwork, if you want to get pretentious, or like a television series. But TNG accomplished, well, it's funny, going through DS9 makes you see the weaknesses of TNG, but you also kind of appreciate how much they accomplished with how handcuffed they were as a creative series, like how limited that series was, and like the limitations of the episodic episode and the way that they didn't want characters to change, that they didn't want things to move anywhere. It's kind of amazing that they managed to produce 178 episodes. 100 of them are pretty good. And then like, it's that kind of a weird thing. And DS9 is totally different. DS9 eventually gets better. But the one thing I've learned about DS9 is that it actually takes, everyone says it takes 2 seasons for Star Trek to kick into gear. DS9 actually takes 3 seasons, I think, because the third season of DS9 is not even, the third season is still kicking the tires of the show in a lot of ways, and a surprising amount of ways. And I think that the show really becomes what it is season 4 onward. So it's only 4 seasons of DS9 that I consider to be exceptional.
Oh yeah, that's another area where I kind of disagree with you on, but we'll get to that more when we get to season 3. Yep. So kind of lost my train of thought here, but yeah, I was thinking with Deep Space Nine. So I remember what I was going to ask you. Sorry. So did you not sort of watch Deep Space Nine growing up? Then did you get into it like more as an adult, like later on, like years after it aired?
This is the first time I've ever watched it all the way through, episode by episode. I know there are probably more episodes of DS9 that I've never seen than there were of TNG. I think there was only one of TNG I'd never seen, and I wasn't even sure if I'd never seen it. I might have just watched it once and forgotten about it. DS9, there's more episodes that I haven't seen, but I know the vast majority of the episodes and how everything shakes out. So this is my first pure watch of anything. I've never actually purely watched any of the Star Trek series before. So TNG was interesting, but I knew what I was expecting. DS9 is a little bit different. It's much more of a reaction that is fresh off of a first viewing than anything, where TNG was kind of like years of, I know this series and these are the things that are going to be. Sometimes the episode ratings that we do for DS9 are total surprises to me in a way that TNG wasn't.
Yeah, and I think I think that's probably going to account for like much of the sort of difference of opinion, because I grew up with Deep Space Nine, both Deep Space Nine Next Generation. As I said, those are my two favorites, but those are the ones I was like as a teenager. I was watching them both repeatedly. So I do think a lot of my opinion might be colored by that fact, by the fact I had this nostalgia attachment to it, if you know what I'm saying. Whereas, like, when it's a show, for example, a show like Babylon 5, which I rewatched recently, like, I hadn't seen that until like 10 years after it aired. So I didn't have that nostalgia attachment. So I
And
wasn't
Babylon
quite
5
as.
looked terrible when it came out. So 10 years later, it looks doubly terrible.
Yeah, exactly. So I didn't have that sort of attachment that a lot of the B5 fans who watched it growing up had. So I think the same thing sort of might apply with Deep Space Nine, which may be why I have a bit rosier picture of it.
Well, the podcast has guests, but as we've moved into DS9, I've sort of settled down with one co-host, my buddy Clay from out here, and because I need more consistency with the people who are watching the episodes to sort of like get a consistent sense of how DS9 serialization goes through. And Clay has been generous enough to join us for the rest of the way. But Clay brings up the good point. He always saw DS9 as the diplomacy Star Trek, is how he said. He has not seen any of the series. He has the sort of broad strokes of what it's about, but he describes it as the diplomacy series, and that's what he sort of thought it was. It's kind of the on a station, people come in and you talk to people on the station and stuff like that, and you have these sort of meetings with people. And early on, he's probably not wrong about that. It changes eventually, but it is a DS9 just has a hard time. I remember when DS9 Emissary came out, I was young, so obviously this kind of response is like rational as a young kid. But when Cisco yells at Picard in Emissary, it's like, hey, you don't talk to Captain Picard like that. It's this kind of like goofy take on things, and DS9 just felt, it kind of rubbed me the wrong way right from the get-go, and I never really got into it. But that's just kind of the fawning fandom aspect of something. Like when you're really into a series and then it changes into another series, there's always that period where you're trying to figure out if you actually like it, if it's really good, if you can be trusted to say that something is good. And I think DS9 falls into that.
Oh yeah, that's probably pretty fair. Cool. Yeah, so let's just go ahead and start talking about season one. So we'll go through the first 3 seasons, and we'll start, of course, with season 1. So I know you were just giving your thoughts, but what are some of your thoughts on season 1 in particular of Deep Space Nine?
Emissary is the best Star Trek pilot out of all the series. It's not a great episode. It's not a good episode, but it's the best pilot, I think, out of all of them. Emissary has the most poetic, metaphorical script idea across the board. About all the others are kind of like clunky, mechanical, the plot's moving here, we're going to move there stuff. Emissary does something really poetic with the idea of the time and the way that they work the prophets into exposing how Cisco feels about his wife. And I think the metaphor is beautiful there. I think they spend way too much time with the prophets, and the episode's too long and has horrible clunky bits where Odo's like, I'm a complete mystery. Let me attend the shuttlecraft launch. And he goes on the shuttlecraft. But other than that, Emissary is really good at establishing the universe of DS9, even though they'll change it drastically from what it is. I think it sets up the series pretty well. And even with some of the things that they never end up fixing, such as the Bajoran aspect of the show, it's still all there in a way that the other series aren't.
Cool. So would you say Emissary is like one of your favorite episodes of the season then?
Emissary is, would I say that? Yes, Emissary is the 3rd best episode of the season. Yeah, according to my spreadsheet. According to my
spreadsheet. See, I'd always actually, me personally, and I don't know, I've always said that, for my opinion, that Voyager is the best Star Trek pilot. I actually care for that a bit better, because for me, that comes together is more of a whole episode that just works as a whole. Whereas with Emissary, I definitely agree with what you're saying, especially the part with Sisko's character story. And I think this is what makes this pilot very unique to me, is that it's it's not so much a pilot like Nixon or Voyager or even Enterprise does, which is like, here's the crew and here's the adventures they're going to go on. It's more like, here's Cisco and this is his troubled past and his backstory. And I thought that was a very interesting way to sort of jump into the series and differentiate it from the Next Generation. So I really like that episode for the Cisco character study and his interactions with the prophets, and like that scene where he's sort of crying over, after he realizes he can't move past his wife's death, was amazing. But the introduction of Deep Space Nine side of that episode, I didn't really care for. For me, it felt like a lot of clunky exposition with like, oh, here's Odo, and I haven't been, where he just blurts out that he's the only one of those species.
He's a mystery. No one knows where I came from.
Yeah. Exactly. And sort of like, oh, here's Dax, and here's Bashir, and he's hitting on her, and here's a orb that tells you, we'll show you a flashback to try to explain Dax is a Trill and all. It's felt very sort of clunky to me. And even the stakes with the Cardassians attacking the station at the end, I wasn't really invested in. I thought that was kind of fake. So for me, that kind of held the episode back a little bit. Like, I still love all the Cisco stuff, but for me, the station stuff didn't quite work as well.
I mean, I think my counter would just be that pilots by their nature are clunky in bad episodes of television because it's a lot of explaining what's going on and setting up stuff. I think that Emissary is special because DS9 is special in that it is not the Starship version of Star Trek. Like Emissary is clearly a Western. It is about the guy who is coming into this town. He's going to be the new sheriff, basically. He brings his son, and they've lost their wife. They have his mother. They go in. Everyone's kind of a misfit. You have different factions interacting in this town. The Bajorans are the Native Americans. The Cardassians are the occupiers and stuff like that. And DS9, I think that you go a long way with just the metaphor there in a way that the other Star Trek shows can't really do. The other Star Trek pilots feel very samey to me because they are kind of like, this is the new ship, this is the new mission, we're going to go here, we're going to do that. Emissary is different, and it's the nature of the show, and it's why DS9 is special. I think it's just the focus of the Western aspect allowed them to have a different theme going into it, and I think that that's important for the show. I think that's important for all Star Trek series, and I think it's like, our podcast is we get kind of a grief from the listeners, but we kind of hated Discovery because Discovery doesn't do enough to distinguish itself from anything. And I think that the series, if you're going to have a franchise where there's like 17 different series and they're all kind of similar, that's bad, basically, for Star Trek. Emissary is different, and that's good.
Yeah, it's funny because when I was watching this growing up, I never really thought of like the Western aspect until like recent years, and especially watching your podcast when you were bringing that up, I was like, actually, that's true. That you make a lot of good points, and the showrunners, the creators, Michael Piller, have even mentioned that was their thinking, that they would definitely, well, since the original series was based off of like Wagon Train to the Stars, let's do this show as a Gunsmoke type show, like Western. And I've heard that before, but it wasn't like actually going back and watching, particularly the pilot episode, that you can see that influence very strong.
And it's great because the Western is one of those genres that you can make any other genre a Western and it will work for that genre. Like the Western is a very one-size-fits-all genre. It's like it got this great sort of heroic archetype thing going on, and Star Trek fitting into that mold makes a lot of sense.
All right, cool. So let me move on. Let me name my third favorite episode of season 1. And
sure.
For me, that would be Captive Pursuit. In fact, this is one of the episodes that I actually liked a lot more in my recent rewatch. So we talked a bit about how minds can change. Because when I first saw this episode when it first aired, I wasn't as high on it. Because
and just so people know, this is the one where the Tosk comes through the wormhole and the alien hunters are hunting him. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So yeah, when I first saw this, I kind of didn't think that highly of it because I was kind of reminded me of Next Generation a bit too much. And on the rewatch, it definitely does. This episode does feel more like a Next Generation feel than a Deep Space Nine feel. but I still love it. In fact, part of me misses how the show starts out, where the wormhole to the Gamma Quadrant was like the unknown coming in, and we have no idea what's going to come in. It was sort of, and I talked about this a bit in my review that I haven't posted yet, but it was sort of a cheat, because one of the main complaints of Deep Space Nine when the show first came on, and I've heard a lot of my friends were complaining about it, is they're not boldly going anywhere. They're just sitting stationary.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I thought the Bajoran wormhole was kind of a cheat, where the unknown will come to them. And even though I do very much prefer the later seasons, I do think the later season kind of lost something by making the Bajoran wormhole more of, this is where the evil bad guys are from, so don't go there. And so I missed sort of the element. And actually, that's why I think, even though I think this episode does have that more of a Next Generation feel to it, I do like that aspect of these strange aliens. Especially, I think the way they introduced this alien was really masterful, because they didn't tell you he was just acting strange. You didn't know what was going on. And they slowly disseminate that he's like this ultimate prey on this hunt. And I think the relationship that he gathered with Chief O'Brien was very well earned. Like, I totally bought these two characters together. And I think this is the first episode, even including Next Generation, that really got me to appreciate O'Brien as a character. So watching this episode recently, I sort of appreciated it more just on that character-based level more than anything else.
Yeah, I think Captive Pursuit is kind of a middling episode of the first season. I have a problem with you mentioned that the reveal of Tosk's information you kind of enjoyed. I had a big problem with it because it's one of those writerly things where there's no good reason for Tosk not to tell people what his situation is. They kind of write it in as like, oh, it's the thrill of the hunt, he's not allowed to tell people. But it's like, this is kind of a stupid reason. Like, he's trying to run away from them. If he was really the ultimate prey, he would do everything he could to get people to help him in that situation. So it didn't make a lot of sense to me. It's and the other thing that you said about the wormhole being in the later seasons, the evil is on the other side. That's kind of how the show did it the whole way through, right? Because every alien that came through the wormhole was bad. My problem with the early wormhole aliens is that they're all kind of stupid and badly designed. I think Tosk is actually okay, but Move Along Home, the aliens there are kind of a prime example of the aliens that were coming through the wormhole. And we'll get more into this as we move along, but that's a very TNG aspect of it. And as we were watching it, we're like, are these aliens designed the same as TNG and we're just sick of it, or are they actually worse than the TNG aliens? Especially after season 7 of TNG, we had kind of that opinion about the aliens and the black leotards and stuff. But that's my problem with Captive Pursuit. I think it's an okay episode. I think it's good. O'Brien always is solid and stuff like that. But it's an episode that I feel straddles the line between what DS9 could do and what TNG could do. And the show depended a bit too much on what TNG could do in its early run.
Yeah, I definitely see that. And I have to say, I agree with you 100% on the complaint about Tusk nuts. Yeah, I did say I did like, how they disseminated, but I totally agree. If there was one complaint I had about this episode, it would definitely be that Tusk not just outright saying, "Oh yeah, I'm this prey," and being silent.
Help me. Right? Yeah.
Yeah, definitely a lot of plot contrivance. But for me personally, I think the rest of the episode works so well that I'm able to sort of look past that.
Sure.
Cool. And in the chat at the moment, I think there's an argument going on of who's better, Picard, Sisko, or Janeway, which is a pretty interesting argument.
It depends. Do they want to know about character or actor or combination?
I think it's interesting characters is what they're talking about. Who's the most interesting character to watch?
Sisko. It's tough. Sisko is the most interesting of the captains. Patrick Stewart plays Picard the best of the captains. And the funny thing about TNG, walking away from the TNG thing, was that both me and my co-hosts were kind of a little bit let down by Picard. Picard comes across as less impressive, I think, than he did in my mind's eye after we finished watching the series. Sisko is very good, but Avery Brooks's acting decisions sometimes torpedo things that he's trying to do. And Janeway is fine, but Janeway is schizophrenic in terms of being a character. And I'm not familiar enough with Janeway to comment too much, but the criticism of Janeway is always that she was different depending on who the showrunner of the show was at that point.
Yes.
So that's kind of a problem with it. Kirk is actually my favorite Star Trek captain. I think he is the most, his evolution from the series to the movies is really cool. And just as like a design of a Superman in space that he was in the original series is the most unique aspect of all the captains, I think. Everyone else is kind of a watered down version of Kirk.
Yeah, I've actually never been that big on Kirk. Maybe that's just because I'm not that big on the original series. But I was always
Kirk.
Movie Kirk is better. I'll agree. Yes, so I do like movie Kirk, but I've always been partial to Picard, and Sisko would probably be a close second. But I totally agree with you on Avery Brooks' performance being a bit sort of inconsistent with the character, and Patrick Stewart is always consistently amazing, although the writing for Picard was awful for the first 2 seasons. Yep. But anyway,
Picard can handle
Picard
can handle weak material in a way that Avery Brooks can't sometimes. And Avery Brooks sometimes torpedoes good material, very rarely, but it does happen sometimes. Avery Brooks is a great director. Not sure about actor. But Avery Brooks can excel at things, but he has these weird. We'll get into his acting style. We don't have to continue with that. But if you wanted to ask something else or move on to another topic.
So let's carry on with the episodes. So what was another one of your favorite episodes of season 1?
Progress is my second favorite episode of the first season. Kira had the most complete arc of any character in the first season. I think you could actually make the argument that Kira's character probably should have been removed after the first season because they don't know what to do with her after that. Her moving from the sort of freedom fighter fighting for, Bajor and then moving into this administrative middle management role is interesting. And by the time that Hands of the Prophet rolls around, she has kind of come around to her new position in life. And the show loses track of what to do with her after that point. But Progress is her best episode of the season. And it's the first. It's probably one of the first of the very heartwarming, touching episodes that the show would eventually get very good at doing. But I like Progress a lot. Progress, if people don't remember, is the one where she goes and visits the guy who doesn't want to leave his farm on Bajor. They have to do some mining or something, and it's going to obliterate it. And so she burns down his house at the very end to get him off the thing. And he holds it against her, but she did the right thing, is what we're told.
Yeah, so this is probably going to be one of the cases where we differ a lot. Because I actually nearly put Progress on my worst list. I've never been a fan of this episode, and a lot of it might be sort of personal preference or personal taste, but just for me personally, I think his name was Mullabach, the old guy who wouldn't want to leave. For me personally, I did not like this character. I didn't like the sort of curmudgeon. Every time sort of he appeared on my screen, I was like, get off my screen. And so it was kind of I don't know, I find this kind of painful to watch personally. And also, I don't know, whenever I think of like an episode that's, for me personally, that I would describe as boring, this episode always comes to mind. And maybe that was my initial thoughts when I was watching this when I was 14 years old. But I don't know, watching it again, I did appreciate it a bit more, but I still think the relations with like Kira almost losing her job, like I think that was a good concept that she would have to be used to being the underdog, whereas she, or not being the underdog, being, the person who is against the underdog, which is a role reversal she doesn't like. I just not sure they executed the concept quite as well as they could have.
I don't even know if I view it that way. I see it as it's a comment on Kira goes from being a freedom fighter fighting the Cardassians who are putting their beliefs onto other people and sort of causing people to do things that they don't want to do. And she eventually assumes that role. And she has to become the thing that she was fighting against throughout Progress, where she fills the Cardassian role of telling this Bajoran what he's got to do to get his stuff in order. And it's a heartbreaking thing because Kira realizes how far she's gone, but she's also doing the right thing because this guy should not be holding up Progress for the rest of Bajor, which is what the storyline is kind of hinging on. So it's a great little beat for Kira, who has moved out of her freedom fighter aspect into this administrative aspect, but she is also younger Kira would have been younger Kira would have hated what Kira has become, is kind of the lesson of that episode. And I think it's kind of a cool, subtle little story beat, especially in the first season, which is filled with kind of goofy sci-fi concepts built around it. But the thing, if you want to say anything about the earlier seasons of DS9, they relied way too long on sci-fi B plots because they were trying to imitate TNG. They wanted to have a B plot that was a sci-fi thing, that there'd be some quantum singularity circling the station or something. And it took them a long time to realize that they were bad at that and that the show wasn't built to do that. And I think Progress is a good example of not doing that kind of stuff. And the show is much, 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 much better when it stops doing the quote unquote hard sci-fi episodes.
Oh yeah, and I'll definitely agree with you there. And I will say that one scene where Cisco goes to Kira while she's on the planet and sort of tries to, basically changes her mind. I did actually appreciate that scene a lot. I think that was an interesting step in the Cisco and Kira relationship. Cool. Cool. So I'll go ahead and name the next episode on my best list for season 1, and that would be Battle Lines. This is another episode I sort of appreciated a little bit more watching it again. Yeah, so this is the episode where they crash on this planet where people can never die, and you have Jonathan Banks playing the leader of this alien rebels. And I was actually already
guest star of the first season. He's maybe the best guest star that they had in the first season.
Well, behind Harris Yulin, I would say.
Oh, yes, yeah, okay, sure, yeah, my mistake.
But yeah, and it's funny because I was already familiar with Jonathan Banks when this episode first aired because he was in this movie called Free Jack, which for some reason as a teenager I really liked, but looking back at it now, it's like, ugh, the movie's awful. But anyway, and I always, so this episode in particular I thought was a good examination, especially as another good character growth for Kira and how she's sort of having to move beyond her sort of violent past. And I love the way Kaiopaka just makes her confront this and how it's juxtaposed by these two factions who just can't get over their hatred. I just think, and I like the tension in this episode too, how when Bashir found out that if you died even once, you were stuck on the planet, stranded there. I think that added a lot of tension to it. And I like that they were bold enough to just write Kaiopaka out of the show like this. And that actually, I think, allowed for some great storytelling in season 2 as far as the Bajor storyline goes. But anyway, yeah, so some of your thoughts on this episode.
I like Battle Lines. I think I have it at number 5 on my list, but Battle Lines is good. What you're saying about Kaiopaka is something I think the series actually did. What the series got very good at eventually was retconning previous decisions that they had made. So they had no idea what they were going to do with the Kais and everything when they just left Opaka. They just left Opaka because it's a character we've met once before and we can have some kind of stakes to this episode if we leave her behind. Eventually, it obviously fills in the rest of the Bajoran conflict with the Vedics and everything because she's gone and there's a vacancy. But the show got much better at doing that, especially with things like Odo and the references to the Dominion and stuff like that. They eventually managed to retcon the characters and the characterization that they had early into better seasons later on down the line. DS9 is kind of interesting in that it basically repeats episode ideas and does them better later on. It just takes the same idea and it's like, we can do this better now, so let's just start over and do it fresh. But that's what Battle Lines is. Great performance from Banks, though. He's very fun in that episode.
Cool. So why don't you go ahead and tell us your favorite episode of season 1? Which I was about to say it's going to be the same as mine.
If anyone doesn't say it's Duet, I would stop listening to them about the rest of their opinion. Like, there's no way anyone can say that Duet is not the best. Duet's one of the best episodes of the series, let alone the first season.
I have actually said, and maybe I'm too attached to this episode, but I have said in the past that Duet is my favorite Star Trek episode of the entire Star Trek franchise. Like, that's how much I love this episode.
No one's going to say that's a bad choice. Like, it's not a weird choice to say that. The Duet is a very strong episode. If people don't remember, it's the one where Harris Yulin plays the Cardassian, and Kira has to sort of get a confession out of him, and he's somebody else. He's not real. He's Maritza or something. I'm forgetting their names, but he is not the guy that he thinks he is, or she thinks he is.
Goldar Hill is yeah, not long to Goldar Hill was, but I think this episode definitely has a strong sort of vibe of the Holocaust or whatever, and then taking and I think that's probably why it works, because this episode, when I first watched it, I was telling people, oh, it brought me to tears, and I'm like, oh, people are laughing at me, you're crying over a sci-fi show, but it's the elements of reality that it brings into it. And even like not just looking at specifically the Holocaust, but even if you think like the messages of like hate, race hate and hatred and all that, I think are universal, and they come off really strong in this episode. And again, like the performances in this episode are just amazing, especially Harris Shulin, as I sort of touched on before.
No, he's got some of the best lines of the first season. The "kill me, torture me, it doesn't matter, Major, you've already lost" is a great, wonderful line. Just the "I'll have to make my lies more opaque" is a great line that he's got in that one. It's all very, very good.
Yeah, almost like all the scenes between, like the interrogation scenes between him and Kira, were just like top notch. Like when I was a teenager, I used to be able to quote all those scenes like word from word. So how obsessed I was with this episode.
It's a good example of, so frequently the guest stars on Trek are terrible actors, and it really just shows, like, if you get a good actor in there as a guest star, they really elevate the material. Like, imagine if that guy had been a bad actor, it would be a forgettable episode. But Yulin brings chops to the show in a way that is always appreciated, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the writing was pretty sort of top notch up there. Just, I think moments that didn't involve Kira and Maritza were still really great. Like, you get the indirect Kira convincing Sisko to let her do the interrogation, which is again another like great moment in the Kira-Sisko relationship.
Yep, excellent. It's a very, very good episode of Star Trek. That's really all there is to say about it.
All right, cool. So let's go ahead and talk about some of our least favorite episodes of season 1. So Wes, if you want to start with one of your least favorite episodes of season 1.
Sure, it's Q-less is number 3. The only appearance of Q, and it's a stupid episode that has Vosh in it, and it's obviously just them trying to hedge on the fact that Q is a popular character on TNG, and we need people to watch this show, and we'll put him in this episode. He won't really amount to anything, and it's just kind of a frustrating. He doesn't have the Q and Picard relationship is missing, and it doesn't amount to anything. It's just a waste of time, kind of. And interestingly, a listener on one of our listeners who is British has a Netflix version that shows him the most popular streamed episodes of a series, and Q-less is number 2 on DS9 on Netflix for streaming.
Well, yeah, that's obviously like Next Generation fans who aren't watching it. Because I'll be honest, like when this show first came out, like months before, there was like TV Guide articles and Entertainment Weekly articles and stuff, and they were like, oh, there's an episode with Q coming up. And so that's like, I was most looking forward to that. Oh, I can't wait till they get to the Q episode. Once they got there, I was like, so disappointed. And it's a shame like they didn't bring Q back again, because I actually I think the concept of Q in Deep Space Nine is actually interesting. I think its execution here was just very bad. Like they focused more on like the stupid auction with Vosh, and Q, like instead of having him interact with the crew, he was just like pining over Vosh the whole time, which was really annoying.
Q only works for me when his role is that of a morality judge. He doesn't work when he's the trickster god, because I think the trickster god stuff is really stupid. And this is the same on TNG, but every Q episode where he is using his powers to actually teach or show you something about a character is far superior to the garbage when he's just kind of causing mayhem around and the characters are reacting to it. And Q-less is not his worst example of that, but it's a example of using the character poorly, because the character is so like Tapestry and All Good Things, like good Q episodes are very good, and he's the only character who can do that for the show, and they waste him a lot of the time.
Oh yeah, it's definitely cool. All right, so I'll move on to my worst list. I didn't have Q list on there, but I agree that's not a good episode. But on my worst list, I had The Storyteller.
Mhm.
Which it has so saving grace in like the interactions between Bashir and O'Brien, because that was sort of the initiation of this relationship, and I think the writers saw that and latched onto it and so explored it more. So that is the one good thing you can say about this episode. And also I guess it portrays the Bajor as more of a more well-rounded, like realistic world with lots of different cultures and not just as are. But other than that, yeah, there's not much good about this episode. Like the whole plot about it's just it was just so poorly acted, it's poorly constructed. The dialogue didn't make any sense, and it was just really silly the way that they contrived the plot of, oh, the guy died and has O'Brien take over. So, but the reason his whole plot was so his apprentice would learn that he's the real, people would regain faith. But that all hinges on Bashir figuring out that there was the storyteller's idea.
Yep.
What if it was? What if he never figured it out? Then they'd all be screwed, and he would have just killed the village. I don't know.
Was it the Balrog or something? Is the evil spirit of the Balrog?
The Balrog.
Yeah. The Storyteller is a prime example. I think it's a bad episode, but it's a prime example of the show not knowing what to do with Bajor early on. And Bajor comes across as very schizophrenic early on. I think the show never really understood what Bajor would be. It never got Bajor anywhere that it needed to be. The Bajoran religion is too vague to be interesting, and they never flesh it out in any kind of interesting way. They obviously set it up to be a very blank template where they could write eventually what the Bajorans would be. But even the Bajoran language is like the prophets and stuff. It's also vague and not interesting. And all of every Kira issue that she has with the Bajoran religion is such a vague nonsense thing that it's just like this bland religious crisis that someone's having. It's just like, I can't believe I'm going against the religion. I can't believe I'm doing this. It would have been much more interesting if, and Battle Lines kind of hinted at this, if the Bajoran religion was that of peace, and that's why the Cardassians conquered them so easily, and the Bajoran resistance were kind of seen as heretics because they fought back against their oppressors, and Battle Lines kind of implies that's what the case was, but they never go anywhere with it. And if, Kira would be that much more interesting if the resistance fighters were heretics and they were doing what they thought was right, but they were also extremely compromised because their faith is not supposed to allow this to happen to them. And they never do anything. They never do anything with Bajor. Bajor is always just kind of a in the background. If we need a political episode, we'll come pull Bajor out of our pocket and we'll go with it.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think that's why all the Bajor-centric episodes going forward tend to feel a bit bland. Yeah. Yes. But anyway, if you want to go ahead and name another episode.
Wishes Were Horses. It's got Rumpelstiltskin in it, and it's just goofy. It's if the episodes are bad, if you could have put the script on TNG and TNG wouldn't have been able to save it in season 6 or something, it's a bad script. And Wishes Were Horses is that. It's got Rumpelstiltskin. It's got Buck Bokai. Cisco gets his baseball, which is maybe the most important aspect of that episode, but that's about it. It's a pretty terrible episode.
Yeah, this is number one on my worst list. This is I would think one of the worst of the entire show. Like this episode actively angers me. I think you mentioned in your podcast this was sort of done before in like Next Generation several times, or like the original series had shore leave, and Next Generation had like Where No One's Gone Before, where their thoughts were brought to life, and those episodes done it better. This is like a cheap imitation ripoff, and I think all the dialogue is just very poorly handled, and like having the weird, it's exactly what you were talking about before about having the weird hard sci-fi thing just doesn't work on Deep Space Nine. I think this was like a prime example of that.
Yeah, I mean, you're always in for trouble if you have an episode that's based around what people are thinking and they're thinking of the stupidest stuff imaginable. It's like why are they thinking about these things? Why can't we have it's kind of the show TNG and TOS had the same problem with they do episodes like Naked Now and Naked Time. TNG's was more offensive because it was the second episode, and you air an episode like that at a point where no one knows who the characters are. And it's like, why is this the second episode? This should be like the second to last episode of the first season after we've had a chance to know everybody and get to know what they're actually thinking. But it's that kind of a problem. If Wishes Were Horses, you don't know the characters well enough to have their thoughts mean anything. Their thoughts aren't interesting at this point in the series.
And I think like even like this episode breaks its own rules about it. It's very inconsistent. I didn't really understand why like Buck Bokai was sticking around the whole time, for example, but the like winter storms and I don't know. It's just a mess. But the one thing I really enjoy, and actually I think it would have made this episode better in a so bad it's good way, is originally they had planned instead of Rumpelstiltskin, it was supposed to be a leprechaun. I was following O'Brien around, and Kel Meany like outright refused and said, "I am not doing that."
Triggering the Irish population worldwide as they see these things. It would have made more sense. I mean, it's not any worse or any more ridiculous. It's just Star Trek has a weird obsession with the Irish for some reason. They put the Irish into everything, and I don't know why. They had that horrible Up the Long Ladder episode with the Space Irish. Yeah, I don't know what it is about the Irish in Star Trek, but they seem to like them.
All right, cool. So we'll move on to the last one on my worst list, because you already touched on my number one, and that is The Forsaken. Watched this episode again recently. I'd never been a Luoxana Troy fan, although I
didn't even remember which episode it is.
Oh yeah, it's the one with Luoxana Troy, and they get stuck in a turbolift with Odo, and then there's this like alien probe that's taking over the station that they equate it to a puppy that's becoming friends with O'Brien, and it also Bashir
stingray, right? A space stingray.
Yeah, exactly. And also Bashir has like this job of escorting these ambassadors around the station, and they're all being dicks to him the whole time. And nothing about that episode worked. Like the whole thing with Bashir, the ambassadors felt very fake, contrived. It didn't feel like real people. The storyline annoyed me. And the whole thing with the computer program, that also felt like a contrived way they introduced it. Like the computer being all foes with O'Brien at the start of the episode felt like it wasn't acting like this before. It felt like let's do this so we can set up the storyline. And then, as I said, like I've never been a fan of Luoxana Troy, and I think there are times in the Next Generation where she can work, but here is just a rehash of plots we've seen in Next Generation. It's like, oh, she has a crush on a man, and she's going to be overly, try to get with this man overly annoying, and it just doesn't work. Like the only saving grace I would say about this episode is you learn a bit about Odo's backstory, and I think the way that he confides in Luoxana by the end of it was touching. That's like the only good thing. Everything else about this episode, I just simply can't stand.
It falls into the Luoxana eventually falls into this cliche where she spends 40 minutes of the episode being obnoxious and then has a final scene where she redeems herself in a very like heartwarming, touching scene. That's one with Odo, where she holds Odo in her dress as he needs to revert to his goo form. I think that Luoxana is tough. The series in general has problems with women, because when you do a podcast where you watch all these episodes, you end up picking on the female characters a lot, especially in TNG. And DS9 did right by the female characters of Kira and Dax, but they couldn't really fix Mrs. Troy, unfortunately. And they do a lot to redeem her just by these final scenes, but she's in the show for a little bit too much, and it doesn't feel like she really belongs there at this point. It's another one of these TNG. We need TNG people to get the series going, and it's just, yeah. I have it kind of as a middling episode. I don't think it was particularly bad, but it's certainly not anything that I'm going to be watching. It's not queueless. I'm not queuing this thing up on Netflix to watch over and over, apparently. But yeah, it's just not a good episode.
All right, cool. So why don't you finish it off with your least favorite of season one?
I'm surprised you didn't say Move Along Home, because Move Along Home is almost, to me, so clearly the worst. It's almost the opposite of Duets, which is so clearly the best. Move Along Home is a terrible hour of TV where you can see the actors actively being upset that they're forced to do what this script says for them to do. It's like bad charades. They have to play hopscotch. They have to pretend that they can't breathe. They have to drink something. And then it ends up not meaning anything. And Quark doesn't really learn a lesson. No one learns anything. Quark is playing a game with no rules to it. It's just whatever the plot says for him to do is what he does. And then he does it. It's like, what's the point? What's the point of this script? There's no point. It's just a terrible waste of time.
And I hope I don't lessen your opinion of me, but I kind of like this episode.
It's number 4 on your best of list. Yeah.
No, not that much. I don't like. I would say for me, if I was gonna give it a rating, like between 1 and 5, I give it like a 2.5. So it's kind of like down the middle for me. Mm-hmm. But I think, I don't know. Maybe it was my connection with it growing up, because when I first saw this episode, I saw the preview for it. They're going to be playing games and it's going to be a fun game episode, and that's what I got out of it. And so I don't know, for some reason I kind of liked this episode. I thought it was kind of fun with the moments, like, now looking back on it now, I think of it as a so bad it's good kind of thing, particularly with Cisco hopscotching going, oh, the rain. Like I just get a kick out of that. And Quark groveling on the ground going, please. Like, and it's funny too, because Armin Shimmerman had said that this was his first favorite episode of season 1, because he thought it was the one that got Quark going, which I can kind of
is what that means. He got a lot of screen time, so he likes it.
Yeah, that is probably what it means. But it's funny because I didn't hear like all the negative stuff until like really recently, like maybe 2 or 3 years ago. I heard people saying this is one of the worst episodes of the entire Star Trek franchise. It surprised me. I didn't actually understand that, but then when I heard like your podcast and other people getting into why it's the worst episode, I can definitely see that. I can definitely think you guys make a lot of great points on how like the game doesn't work and the plot's sort of all over the place. And there's a couple like major flaws in this episode, like towards the end, where they just let Follow get away. He abducted 4 senior officers and made him go through this traumatic experience, and they're just like, "Ha, you!" Like it had a very cartoonish quality to it.
It's that TNG ethos of live and let live kind of bleeding in. It's like, I know that you put us in grave danger potentially, and we got out of this now, but it's like we're just going to have to sort of let you go because that's how Star Trek is. My co-host Clay said the episode is called Move Along Home, but it should have been titled Get the F Out of Here. Would have been his title for it. And I kind of agree with that.
Yeah, I do like that. I don't know. So maybe it's just my own sort of personal attachment. I just got fun out of watching this episode, but I do acknowledge like it is a very flawed episode. But anyway.
I mean, an analog would be The Royale, which is a love it or hate it episode that I actually love. I love The Royale from season 2 of TNG, but The Royale at least has there's like a cleverness to the concept, and Move Along Home just doesn't have there's no cleverness to it. It's very arbitrary what's going on, in my opinion.
Yeah, I definitely can see that. And I also agree with you on The Royale. That's another sort of guilty pleasure for me. Cool. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to season 2. So yeah, let's just jump into switching gears now, getting to season 2. Now, before we jump into the episodes, just quick overall thoughts. For me, like season 2 was a vast improvement on season 1. Aside from Duet, like Duet is the standout. It's an exception of season 1, but the rest of season 1, I think season 2 was really a big step forward, and I think it's different. A lot of people like to compare the first 2 seasons of Deep Space Nine to the first 2 seasons of Next Generation, and I can see that because they're both like the poor, bad start of the show. But for me personally, I think the first 2 seasons of Next Generation were actually much worse, and the first 2 seasons of Deep Space Nine weren't as like bad, particularly in comparison to the rest of the show. And with season 2 in particular, I think like of Next Generation, like season 2 was almost worse than season 1. At the very least, it was just as bad. Whereas
interesting
with Deep Space Nine, I think it was definitely an improvement, like a notable improvement going forward. But yeah,
I think season 2 of TNG is not a good season, but it is the show trying to figure out what it's doing. It's basically season 1 with more interesting ideas, is what season 2 is. And DS9, I'm looking at the scores now. If it wasn't for the second half of the second season, which is a lot of episodes. But the first half of season 2 of DS9 is not particularly good, in my opinion. It starts to get good later on, and they start to settle into a groove, and they're not quite there, but they start to recognize what makes good DS9 episodes. The first half are the episodes that are really hindered by sci-fi B plots. And I think it's Jammer's reviews had a good thing about his point, which I kind of agree with, is the season 2 episodes are schizophrenic in their plots. And occasionally you'll have like a really good A plot, and the B plot will be this horrible sci-fi B plot, and it just torpedoes the entire episode. And they still did that way, way, way too much in season 2. But after about Whispers onward, they had a couple clunkers in there, but Whispers onward, the show starts to really figure out what it's doing. And then from the Maquis to the season finale, which is the Jem'Hadar, the show's pretty solid at that point. I wouldn't say it's the greatest stretch that Trek has ever done, but it's a pretty good sense of where the show wants to be at that point. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So an inconsistent season, I think it's okay. But if you watch DS9 as a curated experience, which I think is probably the best way to watch the show, you're not going to be watching a lot of season 2 episodes leading into your rewatch of the series. It's maybe a handful. Because it opens with the 3 episode Bajoran stuff, which is like, whatever. But I'll throw it back to you.
Yeah, I think I have a higher opinion of the first half of season 2. I think it's this middling of episodes where it kind of dips. I kind of like the 3-parter opening, although I wouldn't say it's one of my favorites, because I think it's definitely not. There's a lot of wasted potential, I should say. It wasn't quite as good as it could have been, but I still think there's some good moments in there. But yeah. So let's actually just go through some of our favorite episodes of season 2. So why don't you kick us off?
Sure. I mean, it would be basically the third best would be the Maquis. I'll say it's just the 2-parter. But I think the reason that the second season starts to improve is because they start to really deal with the universe in a way that they weren't dealing with it prior to that. And I think the Maquis is a big turning point in that. The Maquis is a big sense of Ira Stephen Bear's worldview coming through the show finally, which up to that point had been the Pillar Berman kind of thing, where, you know, they set us up an emissary to the space station and all this stuff is going along. And then they gave us this string of episodes that are just Alien of the Week coming to the station. And it feels really unsatisfying and frustrating. And a big part of being a station is that the thing is stationary, hence the name Station. And you can really build these moments with the characters in a way that the other Star Trek shows can't. And around the Maquis is when they started realizing what they had in characters like Dukat and stuff like that. And realizing that because they were out on the frontier, they could push Starfleet in a direction that the series had never, or the franchise had never gone in. And I think that's important. And the Maquis is a really good episode that really sort of does politics well in Star Trek. It has that Roddenberry, like, overly optimistic view of things, but it also has a realistic grounding of this is a space station out in the middle of nowhere. Starfleet is a bureaucracy that's detached from everything and doesn't know what the boots are doing on the ground, but they still want him to fix things. And Sisko's frustration with that situation comes through. And I think it's a good episode.
Yeah, it's funny. Like, for me, this is kind of like a middling episode. Like, I definitely think there's some high qualities of this episode that you touched on, particularly how they're exploring a different facet of how the Federation policy might not always work. Of course, Gene Roddenberry would be irate about that, but I think it allows for
because Gene Roddenberry is a terrible writer. Gene Roddenberry shares. Roddenberry has what Lucas has. They're great world builders, but they're terrible storytellers.
Yes, I definitely agree. And I think he did hamper Next Generation a lot. And when he stepped back more, that's when it got better. He
hampered TOS too. It's the other writers on TOS who managed to save the series. Roddenberry was writing stuff like Omega Glory and thinking it was good TV. And people like Gene Kuhn were writing good episodes of television.
Yeah, and to be clear, I'm not saying that as a slight on this episode at all. I think it's actually good. It's great. It explores more of this sort of inner conflict, and I love the scene between Sisko and Kira. And I think you have that in a line from that in your opening on your podcast where he's. Yep. Yeah.
out there are no saints. It's a line that I think sums up DS9 pretty well.
Yeah, and that was a great like just moment for Cisco. Like, especially he was just yelling at Kira, but then she actually yelled back and gave the counterpoint, which I thought was really good. But again, like the stuff with Ducat, as I said, this is like fleshing out the character more. I love the interaction between Cisco and Ducat. I think for me, the reason why I wouldn't consider this one of my favorites is probably mainly like the spaceship battle at the sort of end of part 2 with the little runabouts fighting these dinky little ships. Like, to me, that's just kind of bogs down the whole episode. It's not a very climatic way to have these like, you know what I'm saying, these dinky little ships that aren't very capable. And it seems like if that's all the best the Maquis can do, it seems like, well, how are they really a threat to begin with?
The runabouts were, although, are the Maquis supposed to be a threat? I guess would be the question. Like the Maquis are kind of a fascinating little Star Trek break. They were designed for Voyager, but DS9 had to do something with them, and DS9 actually did the most with them, I think, out of any of the series. And I think it's the strength of DS9 is that it can take topics like that and be interesting and be sort of relevant and sort of touching on some level. And the other series can't take topics like that because they're too episodic and formulaic. Like, they have to take a Star Trek approach to what the Maquis are, and DS9 explores what the Maquis are as people. And the Maquis are kind of a screw up of a terrorist organization in a lot of ways. Like, they're not portrayed very favorably, but it's a commentary on, as the Dominions start to enter the picture, it's a commentary on how unequipped or ill-equipped the Federation citizens are for what is truly out there and happening in the universe. And I think that's why the Maquis are interesting. They're, I'll just finish. Their sort of perspective and sort of naivete is what gets the Federation into a lot of trouble going forward down the line.
Yeah, I was actually surprised when I heard that the Maquis had been invented for Voyager, because they were, like you say, they were used so much better on Deep Space Nine. Particularly, this episode established them a lot more than what Voyager ever did. So I was actually, yeah, I think, well, we won't get into Voyager, but I don't think their use of the Maquis was very good. Definitely not as good as it was here. But anyway, let me move on to the next in my best list. Just having a look here. Oh, it's an episode. I just watched a podcast of you doing this episode, and you thought it was overrated. So maybe you'll disagree with me. I'm one of the people overrating it, but it's The Wire.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, I actually, like, for me, this episode grew on me. Like, I wasn't that big on it when it first aired. I was like, oh, it's just Bashir taking care of Garrick, who's acting like a dick. But maybe it's like the retrospective, knowing where they'll take the Garrick character. And
that's 100% what The Wire is. The Wire is not a great episode if you're just watching it as a standalone first time, but once you get to know Garrick, it means more to you.
But I think, I don't know, maybe it is that retrospective knowing where they'll take Garrick, but I do, watching it now, I still get a lot of enjoyment out of, in this episode itself, with the character interactions between Bashir and Garrick, and especially the way that Garrick goes through those 3 stages, and the way that this episode establishes a Nabran Tain at the end. Like, I think that was golden. Like, he is, they did like the best job of establishing it as this really creepy. He has this friendly, outgoing demeanor.
Fatherly.
But behind it, he's fatherly. But inside, he's like one of the most ruthless like killers you'd ever want to know. And I think that scene like portrayed it perfectly, especially the way like it ended by him telling Bashir what he has for lunch or something like that. Like that was just creepy. So I still do really like this episode a lot.
I have no problem with The Wire. I think The Wire has a lot of great scenes. It was more Clay didn't like it when we were watching that one, or because I kind of know what to expect with Garrick. Clay was a little bit let down. I think it's an okay episode. I think the retrospectiveness of it is very key to enjoying that. I think knowing Garrick makes that episode feel like a lot. And because Garrick is so slippery and hard to get a hold on, it's hard to know what you're supposed to feel about that episode, because you walk away not being sure what the truth is in the first place about anything, which is kind of the point, but it makes it a unsatisfying resolution when all is said and done. You're like, well, did any of that really mean anything? And especially if you're in the Star Trek mindset where you're not sure if these things are going to come back down the line, if you're still in like a TNG mindset, you might just dismiss it as that was kind of a goofy episode that didn't really amount to much.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a major component of why I like the episode more years later after seeing the rest of the series. But I don't know if you ever read it, but there's a book that Andrew Robinson like co-wrote about Garrick, where they actually explain the backstory that was never explained here. And I gotta say, have you read that?
It's no, some the patrons or the listeners want me to. It's called like something of time, isn't it?
Stitch in Time.
Yeah. Stitch in Time. Yeah.
Yeah. I gotta say, like, I wasn't that impressed with the book, but the backstory in particular, like, that was very much of a letdown. It makes me appreciate the fact that they didn't explain it here a lot more, because I think it's one of the things that's left better unanswered. And I think that book proved it.
a lot of modern audiences seem to think that getting all the details is a good thing, and you're always better off when you don't know all the details and you can fill in the holes in your head, because you're never going to be happy with the fully fleshed out backstory of characters or like motivations in a movie. Just some things don't need to be explained, and it's better that way.
Cool. So why don't we move along and tell us the next one on your best list?
Whispers, which is a case of the show actually doing sci-fi pretty well, because it is a character thing, and you end up really feeling bad for O'Brien and wondering about O'Brien's state of mind, and also what it means. Whispers is the one where he has he's walking around the station thinking everyone is acting very suspiciously, and he tries to get away to figure out what's going on. And it turns out that the O'Brien we've been watching has been a clone of the real O'Brien, who has been programmed to do an assassination or something. And they find the real O'Brien and they kill the clone. And so O'Brien watches himself die. And it's just a really neat sort of the second season of DS9 was very consumed with identity as a theme early on. You might say it's because the writers were trying to figure out their own identity from TNG, and they were sort of wondering, like, how do you actually do this? But Whispers, I don't know if it was intentional, but a lot of the scripts has to do with identity, and it like Second Skin, which is actually the third season and stuff. But Whispers is about what does it mean to be you, and like, is that real O'Brien acting as a hero while thinking he's the villain, or that kind of thing it's a neat little insight into people, and like, you can never really know what's going on in someone's head that time. And they ended on a very down note, and I think it's an interesting ending for the episode to sort of be somber like that about what has transpired across the 45 minutes.
Yeah, Whispers was number 1 on my best list.
Yeah, it's a good episode.
Yeah, I've recently heard some opinions of a lot of people who actively don't like this, and that again, that shocked me. Like, to each their own, but I guess it seemed like it was kind of a polarizing episode where a lot of people were against it. But I would say, when after the first 2 seasons aired, this was my second favorite episode of the show behind Duet, because it's like everything you said, and just the way that they explored what I love about this episode, because as a Star Trek fan, as a hardened Star Trek fan who's seen tons of Star Trek Next Generation in particular, as I'm watching this episode, I'm like, oh, it's a parallel universe, it's an alternate reality. And I kept
it's a holodeck.
Yeah, it's a holodeck. And I love how they completely subvert all of that to be like, no, actually, this isn't actually O'Brien, and everyone else is fine. It's just a problem with him. And I think the way they revealed that was absolutely amazing. And I do love the fact that, even though some people did point out that he seemed to have died rather easily, just the one shot and just killed him. Why is it set to kill anyway? But I do like the fact that it ended with him dying, his last words being, "Tell Kicker I love her," because that was touching. That had a lasting impact on the actual O'Brien. So it didn't feel like we had wasted all our time with this, clone type character.
That line is the character's insight into realizing that they basically killed O'Brien. Like, that is O'Brien who has been killed there. And they have funny lines about, like, Sisko is like, did he think he was being the hero? Because they're unsure of what his actual motivation was. And he was trying to be the hero. He was trying to save the day. And he dies in a tragic thing like that. And it's just kind of a neat little, it's not a twist, but it's a neat little way to take a character and explore what it looks like to look at someone else and not really understand what's going on beneath the surface. I thought it was kind of a cool little episode.
Yeah, and I thought that dark ending, that dark tone was uniquely Deep Space Nine. Like that's
Yes.
something like Next Generation would never do.
Yep.
Cool.
Well,
Yeah.
you
Anything?
know you have your number two, I think, who you're up
Yeah,
to,
yeah. My number
which is not
two,
Whispers, obviously.
and because that was my number one. My number two would be crossover.
Oh, interesting.
So this was the first Mirror Universe episode where Bashir and Kira go, do the wormhole that takes into the Mirror Universe, and we meet, the alliance between the Cardassians and Klingons. For me, this is the only good mirror, or only really great, I should say, because some of the other ones are okay. But to me, this was the only really great Mirror Universe episode that Deep Space Nine has done. I thought this because ever since Mirror, Mirror, whatever. When Next Generation's airing, there was like a book about how they would use the Mirror Universe, and it was just a copy of Mirror, Mirror, where there was an evil Picard or whatever. And so, whenever I thought of like the Mirror Universe appearing again in Star Trek, that's what I think would be like. This is the evil Cisco or whatever. And the way that they did it here, like, really was totally different than anything like I'd expected. Like, even the previews didn't give away it was the Mirror Universe. That was something that was revealed when you watched the episode, and I was just totally shocked to see that they had this totally different take, and it wasn't as simple as these characters are evil and these characters are good. It was just a lot more complex with this, and I think Nana Visitor and Avery Brooks had an absolute blast playing their mirror counterparts, particularly Avery Brooks. Like, I used to quote his lines like all the time. Just sometimes I love Avery Brooks's over the top acting. I think here it really works, but and the other thing about this episode I always really liked is for me, it's the only Mirror Universe episode, including the ones that Enterprise did, that really captures that feeling, the high stakes tension of holy shit, we're in an impossible situation that Mirror Mirror had, because you get that with Bashir and Kira, that they're trapped in this really weird upside down, fucked up, and you feel that high stakes, high tension, you're on edge for the whole episode, and I think it does an amazing job of portraying that. So this episode always worked for me.
Yeah, crossover. I like crossover. I think it's a pretty good episode. It's more about the mirror universe. I think the mirror universe is. I don't know why people like the mirror universe. I think that the mirror universe worked well in TOS because TOS's ethos and philosophy was so clear cut that the mirror universe made sense on that series. It was like, oh, it's our opposite. They're evil. DS9's mirror universe is basically everyone is slightly evil and they all overact is basically like what the mirror universe does. But the problem is that as DS9 would continue, it would become more nuanced about its like takes on morality and ethics and things like that than TNG or TOS ever were. So the mirror universe becomes less interesting because the show itself is kind of a mirror universe of the Star Trek franchise. Like what DS9 is talking about is a version of a mirror universe of the original TOS philosophy. So DS9 going to the mirror universe has to rely on the politics of the mirror universe. It has to rely on like the Cardassians are now actually our friends, or whatever, like the Klingons are now our enemies, and blah, 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 there's an alliance. And it doesn't really feel satisfying to me because it doesn't. The mirror universe worked in TOS because of how clear the mirror was. And when you have a series that's more nuanced, Discovery suffers greatly from this. The mirror universe in Discovery is meaningless. There's no reason to go to the mirror universe. There's no reason that you don't learn anything in the mirror universe there. And DS9 is kind of a halfway point where it's clearly just done every year because the actors like to play dress up and have fun with their characters, but it doesn't teach you anything about the show.
Cool. All right, cool. So do you want to go ahead and name your favorite or your best episode of
Necessary Evil? Because I like when Star Trek does film noir. I think it's a good Odo episode. It's got a great ending between Odo and Kira. I would fix the ending slightly. It's the one where Odo investigates a murder on DS9 from the occupation. We get our glimpse into the past of when the Cardassians occupied the station, and Odo meets Kira, and Odo solves the murder. It's revealed that Kira had something to do with it. He can't believe that she wouldn't tell him this, and they sort of end on this very uneasy feeling between each other. It's got some of the best captain's log, which are Odo logs in this, because they're written like a hard-boiled detective novel, and they're fantastic. He should do more of them. It's a great look at the station under Cardassian rule is really cool to see. And seeing how Odo was so timid in a way when he was under Cardassian occupation before he'd really found himself, and his character development into what he became while still being Odo all the way through. But he was in the early scenes with Dukat, he won't look Dukat in the eyes and things like that. And then later when they flash forward, he's looking Dukat in the eyes. He is actually talking with Dukat as an equal. It's a really great piece of world building. And just, I like when Star Trek takes genre pieces and makes them fit into Star Trek. I think that's something that the series really has a hold on, and it's a strength of the series that they can do that, and they should do it more often. And Necessary Evil was a really great episode of that.
Yeah, Necessary Evil would be like 4th on my best list. So it is like one of the ones I considered as one of the best of season 2. And maybe I'm just not as big on it, has again like personal taste, because I've never actually been a fan of the detective noir type thing, and I didn't actually care that much for that inflection. But that's just my personal taste. I've never been that much into it. But the rest of the episode, I totally agree. It totally works. I love the way it explores Odo's backstory, and it's really iconic. There's a lot of things iconic mentioned in this episode, particularly the backstory with establishing what Tarek Noor was like before, when the Cardassians were in charge, and what Dukat was like, and stuff like that, and just the relationship he had with Odo, and just like a lot of things that will be mentioned before, like the Cardassian neck trick, like like the dialogue in this episode just really works really well, like the character interactions and everything. And I kind of agree with you that the ending maybe wasn't quite the best when they learned that Kira was the killer, and it kind of puts a damper on their relationship, which is never touched on again in any other episode. But yeah, I do agree that this is definitely a very strong episode.
I would have been fine with the ending if Kira had actually been sent to kill that guy. What they do is that she kills him sort of by accident. Like, he comes in and attacks her, and she kills him in self-defense. And it's a betrayal of what it is, because at that point, Kira's lie is not that big of a deal. If Kira had been lying to Odo about killing someone and being sent there to assassinate someone, that's a big deal. But what happens is kind of an accident, because the producers obviously didn't want Kira to be a cold-blooded killer. So they had to have her kill in self-defense. And I think it just puts a little bit of a damper on the ending. It would have been a modern series that was not afraid of sort of examining what that would mean, would have gone with Kira being the killer. And DS9 wasn't at a point in TV history where it could have done that at that point.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, and I have to say, I was being a bit neglectful of the chat because I was sort of enamored, sort of engaged in this conversation here. But I actually got a super chat donation. I just realized this from Redneck Lover 22, says, "Nice to see you both together." Well, yeah.
I don't know who Redneck Lover is, unfortunately. I don't recognize the name. But hello, and thank you for the super chat to Mark.
Cool. All right. So let's go ahead and move on to season. Oh no, sorry, we still got to talk about our worst. Trying to get out of the worst of season 2.
What's interesting is I remember the worst much less than the best for some reason. That was in the first season too. I think blandness would be a good way to describe the worst of the early DS9 episodes. But you can go ahead with your first one this time.
Yeah, I think particularly season 2. Like, blandness is probably the better word.
Yes.
Okay, so I'll start with my worst. I guess I'll start with my number 3, which is Rivals. The one where they get Prince. What's his Prince Humperdinck from the Princess Bride?
He's a rival of Quark. He sets up like a rival shop, and he has a luck generating machine or something, and it causes the universe to go crazy. I know that Rivals is reviled. I thought it was okay. It's certainly not good, but I don't have the hatred in my heart that you seem to have for it. So you can go ahead and explain why it so doesn't suit your fancy.
So it's they try to hammer in the whole El-Orion thing like a bit too much. Like, oh, let me listen. I'm listening. It's just like, all right, we get it. He's the same species as Guinan. Like, it's
supposed to be Guinan's son, actually, originally.
Was it? Oh, yeah. Wow. Yeah, I'm glad they changed that. But I don't know. Like I wouldn't say I revile this episode. It's not like Venom, but when I was trying to think of what's the worst of season 2, like I had to settle on this one because it's just. I think it's a bad example of a Quark episode. I think there are and Quark episodes and Ferengi episodes have never been my favorite of Deep Space Nine, but
they're bad.
But yeah, but
Quark episodes are okay. Ferengi episodes are bad. Is the way that I think. So.
Oh, really? Because I was just about to say, like, actually, there's some Ferengi episodes or Quark episodes that I think are better than this, or do it better than this one. This felt just kind of like a bland throwaway. And again, it relies on the technobabble nonsense, like the neutrino spinning backwards or whatever, to try to explain luck, which just almost as ridiculous as if wishes were horses. So,
I like it when Star Trek shows you things like this. They're like, this is the most addicting game ever. And it's just a white ball that people are looking at. And it's like, what kind of game is this? Why is this so addicting? It doesn't make any sense.
Oh God! I think the worst example of that is the game from Next Generation.
at least you see what the game. At least you see the game in that case. Like the game makes no sense, but it's it's better than just staring at a white snow globe. I think it's glowing on your desk. It's a bad episode. It is a bad episode. You've convinced me.
Cool. All right. So why don't you go ahead and name the next one on your worst list?
Well, I have noticed, I think I'm on number 3. I have noticed a theme with my worst, which is the 3, which is that they are all character episodes that are misfires for the character. Melora is my number 3, which is the Bashir relationship with the ensign who can't walk in gravity or something like that. That is Melora, right? That's Melora, and that's a terrible episode that is trying to teach something, but does it so poorly that you end up just in this spot of not really knowing who to feel bad for or what's going on. And like it's one of those episodes you spend an inordinate amount of time thinking about the setup for it. Like, how can this be the case in Starfleet that they don't have a better way of doing this? They make some BS thing about this Cardassian architecture doesn't allow her to use her hoverboard or something, but it's like it's such a waste of time. And it was obviously done just for the set piece of them flying around in 0G gravity, but it doesn't amount to anything. And that character is just awful, Melora.
This was number 2 on my worst list.
Yeah, and it's a bad Bashir episode. It's supposed to show us something about Bashir, and it doesn't show us anything about Bashir, and it's just a very stupid. Bashir took a long time for the series to figure out, and this is an example of that.
Yeah, they still hadn't found him at this point. This is just a bad Romance of the Week episode. Like, Romance of the Week episodes can be really awful in all of Star Trek if they're not done properly. And this is probably one of the worst examples of it. But there's a little known fact that I actually hadn't heard much people talking about. But the character of Melora was actually originally intended to be a main cast member. Of the show Deep Space Nine, because I remember
they couldn't cover the cost of the 0G all the time. It's such an idea that's like so stupid. It's like so obvious. It's like, well, you can't have that as a real cast member.
I mean, that combined with the money to go into Odo's shape-shifting, it just probably would have just blown the budget. But because I remember like months before the pilot came out, I read an article in Entertainment Weekly, and they're describing all the characters. There's going to be a Trill, there's going to be a shapeshifter, and there's going to be this character who can't walk, who's dependent on 0G. And I was expecting her, and never came. And then I was like, I guess they just did this episode to have this. Oh, we had this character. Let's just do one episode with her. And honestly, I think she would have worked better as a main cast member. I think having her be the Romance of the Week it was a bad idea, and they should have just left her out altogether. Or at the very least, maybe just had her be a recurring character in the background who they didn't focus on so much in this one episode.
Not to plug the podcast, but this is an episode that I feel we explained better on the podcast, and I'm having trouble remembering why I didn't like this episode so much, but there is some intricacies to the problem and the setup of it. If you care more about my thoughts, you can check out the podcast. But it's an episode that I think is really sort of fundamentally broken, and there's a lot of ways that you can explore why it's broken that way. I just can't pull them off the top of my head. I do remember it as being terrible, but it's a deeply broken episode of the show.
Cool. All right. Well, since you named my number one or my number two of the worst list, I'll move on to my number one and my worst list, which is Second Sight.
Yes, that's my number one worst.
That's number one as well.
That's
I think that's talking about romance of the week episode. Like, this is probably the worst example. It's the worst one I can think of at the top of my head. It's just, and again, it's just like how it's never referenced again. It doesn't have any, and just the whole main plot of Cisco like finding this again. And some people have noted that he falls in love with her like very easily, like very quick. Like, he just sees her in farm, like, oh, we're in love, and it's and
he's rebounding. His wife has died 6 years before. He's rebounding 6 years down the line.
The one thing I would say I appreciated about this episode, just the one thing, is how they dwelled on Jennifer's passing and showed how it still affects Benjamin and Jake, which I don't think the show did enough going forward personally. But I suppose it makes sense. You can't dwell on it too much, dwell on the past too much. But I did appreciate that one little nod. But having this guy like terraformer being all arrogant and he ends up like killing himself at the end, it's just like, yeah, whatever. It's just this episode worked.
On the podcast, we do patron thoughts. So if you support the show on Patreon, you get to leave some thoughts about the episode. And I think Second Sight's, the comments were all just like, I had to look up what this episode was because I don't remember. That's kind of the thing. It's a super bland romance episode that is, again, coupled with a sci-fi B-plot, right? It's like there's this sci-fi thing that is not allowing the characters to have real interactions. So it's Cisco sort of going through some kind of romance thing, but it's tethered to this horrible sci-fi B-plot. And that happens all the time in the second season. And it's a big reason why I don't like the early run of episodes.
Yeah, definitely. I was just looking in the chat here. Cardinal Doomsday was saying Bashir is really annoying in the first couple seasons, which I totally agree with. But Dawn of Ice and Fire is saying that Bashir was the everyman character with his buddy O'Brien. I think later seasons developed him as that. And I think season 2 was starting to develop him as that. But I think he still was getting over that annoyingness from season 1. It was kind of like what you were saying before about they were still finding his character in this season.
First off, hello, Cardinal Doomsday. Good to see you. Second off, Bashir, we've had a guest named Darren Mooney come on to the podcast and talk about it. And I think his take on Bashir is right. Bashir is the TNG character stuck on DS9. Bashir would make the most sense if you transplanted him onto TNG because he's a sort of naive, positively thinking, we can always get to the bottom of this kind of thing, like workaholic character. And DS9 slowly breaks him of that. It removes that from him. It makes him much more interesting, but he comes across as very grating because he doesn't fit into the DS9 universe very well. He's not written to do that. He is the Star Trek fans character from TNG planted into a series that doesn't really support that worldview. And I think that's what Bashir's main problem is, besides the fact that he's written, he kind of has that Wesley young genius thing going on early. And it's kind of annoying. And that's not something that people wanted to see. And he's also sexually assaulting Dax every chance that he gets. And that doesn't work out well. So he doesn't really have a lot going for him by the end of season 2.
I was going to say he reminded me a lot of what they try to do with Harry Kim and Voyager, but at the very least, they figured something out for Bashir. At least they figured something out for Bashir. Harry Kim was always the naive; they never went anywhere with him. But anyway, getting off topic. So do you have one left on your worst list, or do we?
My number 2. So number 3 is Melora. Number 1 is Second Sight. My number 2 worst is Playing God, which is the Trill episode with the proto universe from the Gamma Quadrant that they bring back in. And Playing God is the one where she has the Trill initiative, right? I'm pretty sure that's that episode, yeah. And the big takeaway that I've come away from is that Dax is by far the worst character of the show through the first 3 seasons. And people will say it's Terry Farrell. Terry Farrell was not great early. She gets fine. The Dax character was never given a chance because they never got their feet on the ground about what this character is supposed to be. They never explain what the relationship between the symbionts and the host is. They never explain why this group bonds with each other. They never explain what the positive to joining the symbionts and the humanoid is. They don't explain why who's in control, who's driving. Does the symbiont have a personality? Is Dax a person, or is Dax just a hard drive that exists and you remember memories and you insert them into a new person? And the problem with the Trill episodes is that every Trill episode treats the character differently, and there's no consistency to whose story it is or what this character is supposed to be like. So I end up now just watching Trill episodes going, none of this works with what you previously told me. Like, this is not what the Trill are supposed to be, and now you're changing the rules on me. And that's what Playing God is. It's a weak Dax episode that has a horrible sci-fi B plot. That black hole proto universe thing is just awful.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say like I absolutely hate this episode, but this is definitely one of the more forgettable ones. It's another one I was like, what episode is that? I had to sort of remind myself how it works. And I've recently watched a lot of your podcasts, and I can tell how down on the Trill you are. And I can see that point of view. I'm maybe not quite as negative on the Trill, but I agree with you 100% that they didn't know what to do with Dax, and they were sort of kept changing her character. And this episode in particular, I think, was a drastic change in how she'd been portrayed in the show so far, particularly season one. Season one, they tried to play off as this sort of wise mentor, Yoda type, character that people went through for advice, which makes sense if you're going through the thing with Trills living for centuries. And this episode completely altered that, where she's just rambunctious, going out and having fun, which actually doesn't make sense why she kept rejecting Bashir. It makes it feel like Bashir was just a dork, and that's why she was rejecting him. And so I remember when I saw the previews for this episode, it was all about the proto-universe. Here's a mini-universe. Do they destroy it or do they not? And I thought that was a really interesting concept. I was really interested to see an episode about that, deal with the moral dilemmas. But instead, it's just like it's a B plot in the background. Instead, they focus on this Trill nonsense. So I was just like, what is this crap?
Well, the proto-universe is funny because they bring it over and they're like, this will consume the universe unless we bring it back through the wormhole and leave it there. Like, isn't it just growing on the other side of the wormhole? I don't understand what they accomplished by doing any of that. It's just a bad sci-fi people. Star Trek's always in trouble when your climactic scene is people in the shuttlecraft just going like that as they're dodging stuff, and it's awful drama. That's not good drama, and the show should know better at this point.
Yeah, I can definitely agree with that. Cool. So let's go ahead and let's move on to season 3. Sort of wrap this discussion up with our talk of season 3. Now, this is probably, I would say, where I sort of differ from you the most, because season 3 for me, I had historically always said it was my favorite season of the entire show. Maybe tied with season 6. I think both season 3 and both season 6 I absolutely loved. In fact, when I was looking back at it just today to pick out my favorite episodes of season 3, I found it really hard because I love almost all the episodes in this season. And for me, like,
wow, we are going to disagree.
Yeah. Like, for me, this is and again, not to get too much in future seasons, but I wasn't as big on season 4 and 5 because I thought the introduction of the Klingons as an enemy and the introduction of Worf kind of confused the show a little bit, and they were still trying to find their footings, and it took them till the end of season 5 till season 6 to get it right. Whereas to me, this season 3 was like Deep Space Nine at its prime. It's when they figured out what kind of show it was. You get and they go full on into the premise. But yeah, why don't you go ahead and tell me where you differ from that?
Season 3, going into the podcast, I remembered season 3 as being better than it actually is. I was like, oh, obviously coming off the Jem'Hadar in season 2, this is a great season finale. We're going to be moving into the Search. We meet the Founders. We meet the Dominion basically at large. I'd be like, oh, that'll be wonderful. Season 3 clearly suffers from the writers having done the Search and having no idea where to go with the Dominion at that point. And they weren't sure how they were going to serialize them in. They weren't sure if they were just going to be like a Klingon enemy in the original series that would just show up in random episodes and they'd have to deal with it. Season 3 has a stretch in the middle that goes from Equilibrium to Through the Looking Glass, which are all subpar episodes. None of those episodes are very good, in my opinion. They're all either like average or slightly below average or bad in some cases. Like Distant Voices and Meridian and Equilibrium are all very bad episodes. It it recovers a little bit because they realize that they have to bring the Dominion storyline back in. So when Improbable Cause and Dice Cast comes, that rekindles the show a little bit. They realize what they've got there, and they realize what the way forward with the show is. And all the episodes after the Dice Cast are very quiet, character-based episodes, which going into the seasons 4 onward is what the show actually does. So they start to nail down what works on the show, like Explorers and Facets and The Adversaries, kind of the same family business. Not great episode, but they're very quiet, low-key, work with the characters that we've got and go forward from here. But season 3 really suffers from the show not knowing what it's doing. And I'd argue that they actually take a lot of season 3 episodes and do them better later on. It's one of the seasons that they pluck from and they say, we're going to fix this later on down the line. But that's about it. I think I average, although because I'm a huge idiot, I average all the scores for the things, and season 2 actually comes out 1/100th of a point higher than season 3 for me. So they're basically the same, season 3 and season 2, in terms of quality, in my opinion, except for the exceptional episodes of season 3, which are remembered the most fondly.
Oh, wow. Yeah. I guess we do differ a lot. But yeah, for me, not to get too much into future seasons, but as I mentioned, like season 6 is another one. Like this season 3 and season 6 would be my favorite, but for very different reasons. Because with season 6, it had a lot of great, amazing episodes and some really horrible episodes as well. But the great, amazing ones outweigh the horrible ones. But with season 3, it wasn't so much it had great, amazing episodes. Like there's a few exceptions, which we'll get to in my best list, but most of all, it wasn't one or set of episodes in particular. It's just the overall feel throughout the season I thought really worked, and I thought the characters gelled. Like even the bad episodes, I don't think are quite as bad as the bad episodes of previous seasons. But again, that's just my opinion on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say that Meridian and Distant Voices are two of like the worst episodes the show ever did. Really, Distant Voices is really bad. Meridian is not good. Equilibrium is another bad Trill episode. I think Past Tense is a bad 2-parter. Maybe one of the worst 2-parters that the show did. Yeah, it's interesting. It's a tremendously weak middle section is my takeaway of season 3. And the show is good when it is not doing what's happening in those middle seasons. It's when it's realizing what the Dominion threat represent to the show. And the Dominion changed the show because it focused the show on the politics of the situation. And what the Dominion did was it made Deep Space Nine realize that it had a whole universe sandbox to play in, and it should take advantage of that. And the episodes that don't take advantage of that are the middle ones here, where they are sort of weirdly ignoring this Dominion threat that's on the other side of the wormhole, and it doesn't come across as being believable. And then when they get back to it, it works out.
Yeah, I do agree that they could have used the Dominion more, and the season probably would have been better for it, particularly after the good introduction. But anyway, yeah, let's just go ahead and get into specifics here. Why don't you kick us off with your third favorite episode of season 3?
The Search, which is a brilliant sort of new pilot for the series. And the show would do that occasionally going forward. The Way of the Warrior can be seen as a new pilot for the series too. But the Dominion reveal, the Founders reveal, Odo's sort of revelation. The Search is just a really good action-y episode. My co-host Clay was really interested in The Search. He was really excited about what the show was going to be when The Search came around. And he went through the middle of season 3 saying, when are we going to get back to what The Search was about? And that's it. The Search is just a really strong start to the season.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I like The Search. I probably wouldn't say it's one of my favorites, but I don't know. To me, I feel like they could have done more, particularly with part 2, where most of the episode was taking place in this fake alternate, like, mind fuck thing that the Dominion was doing. But that being said, like, I do love the reveal. I love the reveal of Odo's, like, people being the changelings. Like, I think I never saw that coming in a billion years. That completely blew me away. And it was interesting because I don't want to butcher his name, but the actor who plays Odo once said, like, when he was told that they were going to reveal his origins, he was very much against it and said, don't do it. It will ruin the character. But then once he was told what that reveal was, he was like, okay, this actually makes sense. This push the character forward. And I totally agree with that. I think had they dwelled too long on this, I don't know where I'm from, it would have gotten very, in fact, I think it already did get old after season 2. So I think this was like the perfect time to make that reveal. And I think the way they did it by tying it into the Dominion was a stroke of brilliance.
Odo goes back to what I was talking before about the show getting better at retconning its early mistakes. But the way that Odo was written makes total sense as to what the founders would eventually be. And the series itself seems to believe a lot in if you are genetically something, you seem to have the traits of that genetics, like the genetics push through everything. Odo is a founder at heart. He doesn't want to be because he spent time in the Alpha Quadrant and he's sort of learned the the Star Trek lesson is that basically the warm love of Star Trek or the Federation will just smother any sort of other culture that's around is the main theme of the series. But the Odo's retconning there is kind of brilliant. Like what the show did with the Dominion was kind of brilliant in making them the changelings. And you said you didn't really like the sort of mind screwy aspect of it. I think that the mind screwy aspect of the second part of the episode is sort of a genius take of a new threat to the Federation. Like the changelings are about observation. They say it repeatedly throughout the series. The changelings are about observing what the enemy is, and they need to know how the mind space of their enemies work in a way that the Klingons never did. The Romulans never cared about that. It's a really interesting way to have the changelings be a threat and also show you how the cracks in the Federation come about, because Sisko has little faith that the Federation would be able to stand up to the Dominion in this. He believes that they would give everything just to appease them, and they'd be too willing to give too much, and that's all being drawn from Sisko's mind. And it's fascinating that the show went forward with that, sort of thinking about what does that mean and what would the Federation actually do in this situation. So it defines the show going forward, basically.
Yeah, definitely see that. Cool. So I'll move on to my best list now. As I said, I had such a hard time pinning them because I like so many episodes. So I'll just shout out Civil Defense as a honorable mention. A very, very close. In fact, it's kind of tied with the episode I'm about to mention. So I'll just give a shout out to Civil Defense. But the episode I'll put as my number 3 is Visionary. The episode where O'Brien gets sort of time travels to 6 hours into the future. And
I call it Whispers 2.0, sort of. It reminds me very strongly of Whispers. Mark, you seem to have a type of Star Trek episode that you like, I think, is something that's along the line of Visionary and Whispers, because I find them similar anyway.
Oh, really? Yeah. I never thought of that. I think Whispers is a lot more, I definitely think there's similarities, but I think it's a lot more darker. I think Visionary.
It is. Whispers is better, I think, in my opinion.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I would probably say so too, actually. If you put a gun to my head and I had to choose.
Visionary is a good episode. It's just, I think Whispers is slightly better because Whispers has that dark aspect that Visionary doesn't. Visionary tries to have a dark ending, but when you think about it, you're like, it's not that dark. It's not that bad of a thing that happened.
I never really saw it as trying to be that dark. I don't know. Just for me, like part of what makes this episode so great is the dialogue, the humor, like the camaraderie. Like it has some of the best humorous moments in the entire show. Just even not just O'Brien stuff, but even like Odo saying like, "Oh, I'm going to investigate the Bajorans, the visiting Klingons, the Romulans, and Quark." And then Sisko's like, "What do you think Quark had something to do with it?" It's like, I always investigate Quark. And it's just a lot of like golden moments to this episode, which I think just throughout the entire episode, like the chemistry just works on a higher level than most average episodes of Deep Space Nine. And also I do like, because we were talking before about however when you bring in the weird sci-fi shit into Deep Space Nine, it doesn't work. I think this is one of the rare examples where it really does work, because I think because it plays off of the characters, the interactions, and the exploring O'Brien's character, how he's dealing with this. And I think the stakes and the tension were really high with the Romulans and the twist. So yeah, this episode really worked for me.
Yeah, Visionary. I'll say the problems of Visionary. The problems of Visionary is that by the end of the episode, O'Brien knows something catastrophic is about to happen, yet he still takes a nap every once in a while. Like, that doesn't make any sense. He should be constantly awake, waiting for past O'Brien or future O'Brien to show up and tell him what's going on. He doesn't do that. It's very funny. But what I meant by a dark ending was that the show wants you to think that O'Brien killing himself has left you with a new O'Brien, and it has, but it's not really. It's a couple hours different O'Brien. It's not like it's a alternate universe O'Brien that's shown up. It's just O'Brien who has slightly more memories than the other O'Brien. And I think that for that reason, Whispers lands better, because Whispers actually leaves you thinking about what that actually meant in a way that Visionary did not.
Yeah, I'll definitely agree with you there. I never really thought much of that whole, and I was trying to think of the timeline, because I know Voyager ended up doing pretty much the same storyline with Harry Kim, but I think there was actually a year after this one, so I think this one did it first. But I actually think Voyager did that particular point better, in my opinion. But yeah, anyway, let's go ahead and move on to your next on your best list.
Sure, 2 and 1. I'll do them at once, just because it's Dies Cast and then Improbable Cause.
Oh, kind of I had counted them as one episode myself, so I sort of cheated. Yeah.
So I mean, I won't. It's not spoiling anything, but those would be Improbable Cause is a tighter script, so I rate it a little bit higher. It's a much tighter story than the Dies Cast. The Dies Cast is kind of the the space opera epic that everyone is clamoring for, and they both have great moments, but they're both a huge step forward for the series and what it means, and the playing with the political aspects, playing with the different races, the Cardassians, the DS9. What DS9 does as a series is it really understands the cultures of Star Trek in a way that the other shows don't, and the way that the Klingons and the Cardassians interact and the way that they handle a problem, which in this case is the Dominion, always feels very true to that culture. The way the Dominion are a good way to show how the Alpha Quadrant races react to things, and it's a good way to open up the writing in a way that was kind of limited on previous shows like TNG, and that's what Improbable Cause and the Dies Cast really excel at.
Yeah, this was my number one. I put both episodes together, but I actually agree that I do like Improbable Cause a bit better than Dies Cast, mainly because I think this is Garrick's best episode, probably. This, you get a lot of quotable lines from Garrick, and it really sort of explores, it really plays with him. Whereas what they did in the next episode with the whole side plot of defying orders to save everyone, let's just introduce each other, because unlike the other characters we've seen bullshit, and so it's interesting getting that new dynamic and actually see them bond in the next episode where Garrick is forced to torture him. I think that was, and of course this was to me a first in the entire Star Trek franchise to see that. Oh, have I blinked out a bit?
No, you're still there.
I'm still there. Okay, cool. So this is a first in the Star Trek franchise, in my opinion, because this is the first time they really play with political landscapes in a way that Star Trek was always afraid to, by having the Romulan Cardassians team up to take on the Dominion. I remember being completely blown away, and this apparently was a sign of things to come with Deep Space Nine, and what really, really sets it apart from Next Gen.
Yeah, it's just that world building is what sets it apart. It's really in the interest of the series for me in DS9 is how the cultures and the societies are working against each other, and it's just two they're sort of brilliant episodes that do that. They're very intelligent.
Cool. All right, so we'll move on to number 2 on my best list, which I know you're going to disagree with because you mentioned it when you were going through some of the worst episodes, and that is
past voice. Past tense. Okay.
Past tense, yeah. Past tense I would actually put in my top 10 of the entire show. This episode was really preachy, but in a way that I liked, I guess. I think its preachiness really came across the point that they were trying to come across. And I do think that I like the character stories in this. I like we barely see. I think this we're talking about Bashir. For me, this is when they were really getting a handle on Bashir, and to see his be the same one to interact with Cisco and to see them carry the episode, I thought really worked. And I absolutely loved the supporting cast, particularly BC. I think he was an extremely dynamic character. Like Iron Stephen Bear had been quoted that he didn't wanted him to be a bit more dynamic than that. And I think that definitely came across. And I just love their interactions. It had some funny moments with Kira and O'Brien going through the past and stuff like that. So the episode really worked for me in that regard. Although I will say the one knock I always have against this episode, which I'm always hesitant to put it in the top 10, is it uses some of the worst time travel logic I've seen in any Star Trek episode used. Like the time travel logic they use in this episode makes no sense. But if I look past that, I think the character interaction, the social commentary, it all is really a top notch for me personally.
Past tense is tougher. I think past tense is one of those two-parters where it was too much material for one episode, but it's not enough material for 2 episodes, so it kind of drags through the second part. It's another episode that deals with identity because Cisco is assuming the mantle of Gabriel Bell, and he seems relatively nonplussed by that sort of chain of events. It's a very odd. I understand what they were trying to do, and they were trying to show why the Federation would be born of something like this. It doesn't feel very effective, and the setting doesn't work for me. It feels very much like a Verhoeven sci-fi 80s movie in the way that the set design goes about things, but Verhoeven was doing that for a reason, and here it just feels cheap. And it's a lot. What I remember about past tense is a lot of people standing in a big room looking at each other with shotguns, and that's like my takeaway from past tense. And I don't know if Star Trek does that well. I will say I did enjoy Kira and O'Brien going back in time to random points of history. I just like that little joke. I thought that was kind of cute.
Yeah, and it was interesting because I did a full-length review for this episode, I think about a year ago, and it was interesting watching it and comparing. This was taking place, 2004, I think, and we're almost there now. So it was interesting seeing how
almost there. Was it 2004? Was it later than that? I actually don't know.
2024. Sorry, it's
24. Okay, there we go.
Yeah, that makes more sense. Yeah, no, 2024, and we're almost there. But it's interesting seeing how they would predict like the technology and everything, and I think they got it eerily right. I mean, there's some obvious like blunders. I mean, particularly with the fashion, but that's a hard thing to get. But I think
iPhones.
Yeah, no iPhones is the other thing. Yeah, I talked about that as how if the characters in this situation had an iPhone, then they could be able to solve so many situations they weren't able to solve. But other than that, like they were very dependent on like the internet, and they even had like pop-up ads and stuff like that. So, and a lot of the other technology, I was actually impressed comparatively speaking, because usually shows, because you got to think in the early 90s when this was made, like the internet was there, but no one really thought much of it. Like it was just this low ass thing. So I was actually impressed with that in that regard, and especially the social constructs of society. I think they pretty much got head on.
Yeah, they did good with it. I just feel it was there's a point in allegory where Star Trek gets too blunt, and I feel like past tense hits that a little bit too hard. It's a little bit too. There's a lot of talking about the situation, and it's an episode that really suffers from the show don't tell aspect, and TV doesn't really follow that as much as film does. But it's just a lot of explaining. It's endless scenes of Cisco explaining to Bashir as they're walking down a road, and I can understand why people would like it. It just doesn't really. It felt to me like it was an attempt at what the show was trying to do in later other episodes, and it just didn't do it that well in past tense.
Cool. Yeah, no, that's fair enough. Cool. So let's go ahead and move on to our worst list. And I have a feeling ours might be identical, but let's see. Let's start with your worst.
Equilibrium, which is the Trill.
That is Equilibrium. No, that's not on mine actually. But I do agree it's not a good episode. But anyway,
yeah, I mean, yeah, in the context of time, it's another Trill episode. It's another episode that doesn't mean anything to me. And this is the one where they expose sort of the lie of Trill society, which is that Is that Equilibrium? Is that one, isn't it? I'm pretty
Yeah,
sure that's
yeah,
what.
it is.
Yeah,
It is.
yeah,
They
and
find out that Dax has the hidden host that they're trying to keep
yes,
secret because he
yes,
killed someone.
that's right. And while I like the eyes wide shut, creepy mask scenes. Other than that, it's not a good episode. It falls into the same problem all the Trill episodes do, which is that you don't have any idea what the grounding of reality of the Trill characters are supposed to be.
Yeah, Duran, Colonel Doomsday points out that was his name.
Duran.
Actually, I think they really misused him later on. Like, I had more issues with how he's misused in the future than that doesn't really connect with this episode, but I guess that goes with what you're saying about how they're never consistent with the Trill. As I said before, I don't have as big of an issue with the Trill, so I didn't have that big of an issue with this episode, but I do agree. Like, I always thought this episode is just bland. Let's move on.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of thing.
A good judge is if you have to look up the episode to remember what it's about. It's not a good episode. That's a general rule of thumb.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll move on to my number 3, which I think you probably have it on yours, which is because it's another Dax centered episode. Is Meridian.
Yep.
We were talking about
Meridian is my worst episode of the season.
Oh, it's your worst. Yeah. Yeah, I just put it as my number 3 because I'd never found it like that offensive, but it was more of it's the key. Let's skip this episode. I don't really want to watch it again. It's just the throwaway romance. And it has to say, I think Second Sight was probably worse in that regard, but still, this doesn't offer anything new. I think they're inconsistent with Jadzia's character in this episode, falling in love with this random guy. And
why would a Dax symbiont fall in love so immediately? With the Dax symbiont should know from lifetimes that this is a bad idea, that this does not make any sense, and that you should give up on it. It's another case of the Trill not making any sense. That the Dax memory should overpower whatever Jadzia is doing, and she should be you were talking about in the first one, she's more of a consigliere type character. That makes more sense for Trill. That is the way that Trill should actually be, and she never acts that way. They try to play it off later as it's the Jadzia personality, but at that point, what's the point of having a Dax personality in you? If you're not going to draw from the experience of the Dax symbiont, why have it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree that the show didn't know what to do with her, and just the planet disappearing and reappearing is more technobabble nonsense.
So what? Not to interrupt, but what's your take on how does a Trill work?
Well, God, that's a hard one. How the Trill works. I mean,
so why? First question: why do they join?
Right. Well, I get the impression that there's these symbionts that are dependent. I don't know if this is right in canon or whatever, but I get the idea that they're dependent on having sort of host to live on. I think there's some that don't, but others feel like their lives are enhanced, and once they start, they can't live without a host.
They live in little pools. We've seen that.
Yeah.
They live in like little cave pools or something, and they get put in.
I think that's the uninitiated before they're ready to join or whatever. And and it kind of makes sense because being in little pools, you don't really experience the world much of having a human or a Trill, like body. And I think, and I get the impression that the hosts see this as like a huge honor because you completely changes your life. You gain more status. Although I think you mentioned before they try to downplay the status too much to not make it aristocracy.
Yeah.
But I just still think it gets some status, not like complete rule or whatever, but it's seen as more sort of prestige. We get that a bit with that episode in season 2 with Duran or wherever, who was really jealous because he got rejected and didn't get one. And I get that once they're joined, I just see it as, I don't know, not to be cliche, but as a joining, like that they sort of become a new person together. And I do see what you're saying is the show for sometimes will contradict that and won't be consistent with that entirely. But that's generally how I look at it.
So does the symbiont have a personality?
I think the symbiont's personality has a dormant personality. Let me put it that way. It has its own personality, but it's subject to change depending on who it's joined with. But if it was like taken out and it was on its own, it would have its own personality, but it would be kind of a fraction of what it would be if it was joined, if you know what I'm saying.
So you could talk to a symbiont? if it was not joined with someone? Is that like, because
Well, doesn't that with that guy who the Guardians, whatever, who looks after the pools? Doesn't he talk to them?
well, they seem to shoot each other with lightning bolts. Like the Trill symbionts seem to talk to each other, but
Yeah.
that it's the my problem is that the Trill don't. I need to know what the driver is to care about the story that's happening, because there are two ways. You could either have a Dax story or a Jadzia story going here, because the Dax symbiont has totally different characteristics and a totally different story than Jadzia does. Jadzia has a totally different joining perspective. And to me, their joining doesn't make any sense because neither of them seem to get much out of the joining, other than the symbiont gets to seem to ride around in a body for a little bit. The people seem to get some memories, but they don't even seem to accumulate skills, because Jadzia is a lieutenant commander. It's like, shouldn't Jadzia be the most brilliant person that's ever walked around, because she should have all these skills built into her? And she's not that way. So a listener actually gave me a solution that would have made more sense. If the Trill humanoids were cavemen and the symbionts were helpless, but they were super intelligent, and if you combine them, they made a regular human type person. That makes sense to me. Both people get an advantage out of that. The symbiote gets to move around, and the cavemen people get to be a little bit more intelligent, and that gives a benefit to both of them. But anyway, we can get back to the episodes.
Yeah, that definitely is interesting. I was just going to say real quick that I never really saw it as Jadzia and Dax as two separate. I think they started out separate, but I think once they joined, they don't have like different likes and different takes. I think they joined together whenever their likes and dislikes or whatever preferences were before joined to form an opinion, so they have one singular outlook on life going forward, if that makes sense. But it's dependent on sort of the joining of these two. I hate to evoke this episode because I don't like it, but it's kind of like that Voyager episode Tuvix, where Tuvok and Neelix join together to create a new being. Like their new being has like thinks of Kes as a lover and as a mentor, because it's taking parts of both of them. That's kind of what I see with the Trill.
I'd be fine with that, but to me that implies that the Dax symbiont is not a person. It's just accumulation of memories. It's like a hard drive that you plug into people, and those memories become a part of this new person who becomes a new person that way.
I think sometimes they definitely play it off that way. I will definitely grant you that.
I just think it would be more interesting if Dax the symbiont was a personality. I think that's a more interesting way to take it, I think, in my opinion anyway.
Well, anyway, I think, yeah, so, why don't you go ahead and name, I think we just got your second worst left.
Yep, Distant Voices, which is a terrible Freddy Krueger-esque ripoff that doesn't really work, and it is a Bashir bad episode that has characters explaining that they are memories of Bashir or something, or they're in Bashir's mind. It's one of those horrible episodes that the characters realize they're fake and they talk about it. It's a very dumb episode that's very boring and doesn't take advantage of the process. The setup of the structure of the story doesn't work for what the story is that they end up telling, and it just all sort of falls apart by the end of it.
Yeah, this was my number one one worst of season 3. This is just it's a failure, and it's a misuse of Garrick. Garrick is such a great episode, and yes, they have him be haunting the Doctor the whole time, and it's like, oh no, he's actually a villain. He morphs into that weird alien creature the whole time, and I think whenever you're doing an episode or a story, this is all taking place inside someone's head, yet it looks exactly like the station and it has all the same characters. It's really problematic to me. I think there's very few episodes that actually take that premise and do something with it. I think it's a very hard premise to come from to sell me on. And I think this episode does a horrendous job at doing it.
Well, it comes across like a junior high school English paper, where it's like you take this one blunt personality thing from each character and you're supposed to say like they symbolize this part of my personality. It's such a hacky idea, and it's a Minosky script, so I'm sure it was much more complicated at first and they had to kind of dumb it down, but it just doesn't you need more thematic material in an episode that's like that. You can't have this sort of weak theme pasted onto this bad sci-fi idea, because the episode could have been good if it was actually about anything. If it was thematically exploring Bashir in a way that wasn't some throwaway at the end of the episode, it would be fine. There'd be no reason to have any problem with that. But they don't do that. They don't, in a way, they don't go weird enough with it. It should have been a really weird episode, and that would have held my attention. But it's not weird. It's pretty straight ahead.
Now, I'll agree with that. I'll agree with that, because especially if you're going inside someone's head, because if you imagine what it'd be like to be inside someone's thoughts, it would be very disjointed. It would be very weird,
chaotic.
Chaotic. And this is too straightforward. And it's probably budgetary reasons. Like, they have to have a bottle episode. They use the same sets and the same actors, and it just doesn't work.
Yep, 100%.
Cool.
Yeah, right. And my worst was Meridian, which we talked about. But so my 3 are Distant Voices, Equilibrium, Distant Voices, and Meridian.
Yeah, and for me personally, like, I would say, just my personal opinion is that Distant Voices is probably the only episode of season 3 I would say is truly bad and like one of the worst of the show. Or maybe my number 2 as well, which I'll get to my number 2 because we hadn't gotten to that yet. And that is Fascination.
Interesting.
Another Luoxana Troy episode. So this is the episode. Apparently, she's going through. Is it like menopause? I don't know. She's going through some weird Betazoid BS thing in order to have a plot of whoever she touches or.
Oh, she's sick or something, isn't it? Yeah, she's sick or something.
Yeah. She has a disease. That's right. Yeah. And whoever she meets with, like, falls in love with each other, and
because she is Luoxana Troy and she's in love with everybody, so it passes off.
Yeah, because she's in love with Odo and she's projecting this feeling as everyone starts to fall in love with each other. This episode was ridiculous, and people made the same argument for this episode that I made for Move Along Home, that it's fun. And if you get fun out of this episode, good for you. Fair enough. I mean, people could say the same thing about me with Move Along Home. But for this episode, I don't find it fun. I just find it very poorly written, very annoying to watch. It relies on the cliche of, let's have these characters pining and kissing each other and stuff like that. And it doesn't. And again, Luoxana Troy, why are they bringing her back? She didn't work the first time, and this time is like even worse in my opinion.
Roddenberry's widow comes back. I don't mind her that much here. The thing I like about Fascination is the same thing I like about Civil Defense. The show doesn't do a lot of episodes that really show you what the station is like. On Civil Defense, they reminded you that, oh yeah, that's right, the station was actually a murderous labor camp. Like, it was a death labor camp, and that, like, you see that in that episode, and that was really cool. It's like, oh, you get to see a part of the station you've never really seen before in Civil Defense. And Fascination accomplishes the same thing, but through direction. Avery Brooks directed that episode, and he does camera movements that move between the floors of the station, and it makes it actually feel like it's a real place in a way that TNG struggled to do, because TNG is very much sets. You're on the bridge, you're in the holodeck, you're on the transporter room. The DS9 direction of this episode really makes it feel like a town. It brings back that Western atmosphere where people are having conversations on one level. You can pan down and people are below you having a conversation existing at the same time. And the plot is terrible for Fascination, but on a directorial world building level, I think it's an accomplishment of direction for the show.
Oh, really? That is an interesting perspective. I hadn't really considered that take of the episode before. I was just too distracted by people falling in love. But it's interesting that they had Bashir and Kira sort of making out and kissing with each other. You got to think that this is kind of maybe the formation of the two actors getting together, because they got together in real life around this time. So that brings an interesting dynamic to it. But anyway, we'll go ahead and wrap up the discussion here. We've been going for pretty much 2 hours. Just any final thoughts you have on Deep Space Nine as a whole, as a season, or maybe looking forward to the coming seasons that you're about to get into, seasons 4 through 7.
Yeah, we're doing season 4 now, and season 4 is off to a very strong start. You see the change in the show in season 4. It's a show that's much more confident and much more capable and much more believing in itself that it can do smaller stories on the side. I still think it took 3 seasons for the show to figure out what it was doing. It was an evolution each step of the way. Season 1 is pretty bad. Season 2 is better. Season 3 is better. but it is not. Season 3 is not like TNG's season 3 is in my opinion, the second best. No, it's either first or best season of TNG in general. It's either 3 or 6 if you're watching TNG. DS9 season 3 is not anywhere near that. It's an evolution beyond that in season 4 onward. But I don't know. It's the show. The basic summary would just be the show battled its way through trying to be TNG for a long time. It was horrible when it was trying to be TNG. They eventually settled into a little groove where they were the black sheep of the Star Trek family because Voyager came on and they were able to do stories that they wanted to do and characterization stories and plots that they wanted to do. And they're digging into the characters in a way that you never got on TNG and TOS. You know more by the end of season 2 about the main characters of the show than you learned through 7 seasons of TNG. You know nothing about Geordi LaForge by the end of TNG. And you know pretty much everything about all of the characters through season 2 in this show. And that's a big, big difference. And it's a much more mature storytelling kind of way. Not to say TNG is bad. It's just a different storytelling way of being. And DS9 really excels at that at a certain point.
Cool, great. Yeah, no, again, thank you so much for joining for this conversation. It was so great to sort of hash this out and get the different perspectives. And again, it's like listening to your podcast a lot. It's like how thought out and analytical it was. So it was actually really enjoyable to actually have a conversation with you about that. That was equally as thought out and analytical, even though we don't always agree all the time. But I think it was great getting into those different perspectives.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. If you guys are interested, we have the podcast. You can go to thepenskypodcast.com or you can go to the YouTube channel. All the stuff's there. Clay is going to be guesting all the way from here forward. He's kind of the color commentary person. So there's more jokes on the podcast would be the way I'd describe it. Yeah, it's we're having a lot of fun. We're enjoying it. And if you guys enjoyed this discussion, the podcast is more kind of the same. But thank you very much, Mark, for having me on. It's been fun.
Yeah, and I definitely recommend checking out the Pensky Files. Definitely worth it. I'll definitely be checking out the podcast going forward. Anyway, yeah, thanks again so much for joining, and thanks to everyone in the chat. Cardinal Doomsday, The Reverse, Don Willie, Matthew Ross, everyone, Thoughtful Critic, everyone, thank you for chiming in there. Sorry, didn't have much time to get to your thoughts, but thanks for joining. And anyone who's watching this in the archives, thank you so much for joining, and we'll see you guys next time.